Before I introduce them, I just want to take 1 minute to get to know the audience a little bit and find out some of the issues you're interested in that good messaging could positively impact. So is anyone willing to volunteer some of the issues you're interested in? Yes?
Immigration.
Immigration. Yes?
Universal basic income.
Universal basic income, yes.
Climate change.
Climate change. Yes?
Universal healthcare.
Universal healthcare.
Education.
Education. Any others? Okay, good.
We can solve all those tonight.
Yeah. Let's work on those, guys. Let's make that happen. Great. Well, I'll introduce our panelists and then we'll dive right in. Reed, since you're next to me, Reed Galen is an independent political strategist and an owner of Summit Strategic Communications with over 20 years of experience providing high-level counsel to Fortune 50, 100, and 1,000 companies and high-profile state ballot measures and candidate campaigns in California, Texas, Colorado, Oregon, and Utah, among others. He served as deputy campaign manager for John McCain's presidential campaign, for Arnold Schwarzenegger's successful 2006 re-election campaign. He's also previously worked on the 2000 and 2004 campaigns of George W. Bush, spent a year at the White House, and served the Bush administration at both the U.S. Department of the Treasury and the Department of Homeland Security. He's published his work in the Orange County Register, Real Clear Politics, Politico, Breitbart, California, and The Blaze, and is featured regularly
Blaze,
on...
how old is that bio?
That's the one I have for you.
Oh,
For NBC Nightly News, Washington Post, the New York Times, and the LA Times. Another interesting fact, I'm going to say an interesting fact about each of you, is that Reed also left the Republican Party in 2016 after Donald Trump's nomination. Let's move our way down. Natalie Peris next. Natalie serves as the director of the Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute, as an associate dean of the David Eccles School of Business at the University of Utah, and as the chief economist for the Salt Lake Chamber. Natalie has advised Utah Governors Norm Bangerter, Mike Leavitt, and Olene Walker. She has served as a political appointee in the George W. Bush administration as well, serving as an associate administrator at the EPA and counselor to the Secretary of Health and Human Services. For 7 years, she led the public policy priorities of the Salt Lake Chamber. She's authored over 250 published columns in Utah Business Magazine and Deseret News, and co-hosts the weekly radio program Both Sides of the Aisle on KCPW Public Radio. Natalie serves on the Utah Olympic Legacy Foundation, World Trade Center Utah, and Primary Children's Hospital boards. She's also a Utah Transportation Commissioner and Vice Chair of Envision Utah. She has both an undergraduate and master's degree in economics from right here at the University of Utah and teaches public finance. Another interesting fact about Natalie is that she assisted with the drafting and promotion of the Utah Compact, a widely heralded document supporting immigration reform. Troy Williams is next. Troy is the executive director of Equality Utah with over a decade of experience as a community organizer for the LGBTQ community. He graduated from the University of Utah with bachelor's degrees in both film studies and anthropology. Troy was the community affairs director of 90.9 FM KRCL for 10 years and was the executive producer and host of Radioactive. His work has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Salon, The Nation, Interview Magazine, The Gay Times, and Out Magazine. In 2010, the Salt Lake Tribune dubbed him the gay mayor of Salt Lake City. Troy has appeared on Anderson Cooper 360, Democracy Now!, CBC's Q, and the 2012 Showtime special Larry Wilmore's Race, Religion, and Sex. Troy became the executive director at Equality Utah in September 2014. Another interesting fact about Troy is that he was once a member of the ultra-conservative Utah group, the Eagle Forum.
That's right.
And last but not least, we have Maura Carabello. Maura has been called one of the most influential people you've never heard of. As the founder and president of the Exoro Group, she has over 18 years of experience as an advisor and strategist to Utah's top elected officials, nonprofits, and business leaders. Her work in strategic communications includes media relations, crisis communications, and audience mapping, among many other services for high-profile clients, such as the Nature Conservancy, the Count My Vote ballot initiative, Intermountain Healthcare, Zions Bank, and the Governor's Office of Energy Development. Maura's other experiences span development work in Uganda at Time Inc. and as executive leader of several organizations. And another interesting fact about Maura is that in 2016, the Salt Lake Chamber honored her with the prestigious Pathfinder Award because, among many other reasons, she continues to be a major factor in inspiring women across the state to run for elected office, to engage in civic and community causes, to demand their seat at the table, and to raise the level of public policy debate in Utah. So thank you all for being here. I would like to start with some questions for each of you, starting with you, Maura. You work in strategic communications. How important is it to know your audience for the creation of your communication strategies, and how do you begin to understand your audience well enough to message successfully to them?
Good question. I mean, I have a sense today that we're all probably going to layer on top of each other a little bit. So knowing your audience, I mean, I think for most of you it's probably a clear answer in which audience often determines the type of communications and the type of campaign you're going to run. So knowing your, and in campaign I'm using small c, right? I'm not talking just about campaigns, I'm talking about movements or public dialogues that you want to create. So understanding your audience is so key. I'm going to insert something here, which is research is key. And opinion research has now a lot of outlets. Nonprofits and people on low budgets are using technology as a great way to check in with their potential audience members. I think it's a miscommunication that people think research is often used to tell the communicator what to think. I really think this is the way to go into your audience and say, what's the disconnect between what I think you're thinking and what you're thinking? It also leads to what kind of campaign or what kind of communication. Are we pretty much squared up, and my goal as the communicator is just making sure you know my movement exists and that you should come and vote yes or take an action or attend a meeting or whatever I'm trying to get you to do? Is that the point of our communication? Or the research may show me that you're 3 or 4 steps away from where I want you to be, or my point of view. And so I now know that it has to be pretty in-depth and pretty robust, and I'm gonna have to bring you along. Maybe I have to even change some of your attitudes or opinions along the way. So understanding how connected your audience is to what you're trying to achieve becomes incredibly critical. I think there are paid opinion researchers that still can go really in depth and do qualitative and quantitative research and really help you understand. One good thing to remember when you're trying to figure out your audience is you have to ask people the question several ways, because as humans, we're naturally hypocritical. You know, on one hand, if you say it this way, I'll give you an answer, and if you say it this way, I'll give you another answer. They're both sort of truthful to me, so word selection really matters, asking people questions several times about what they think. And then the other really interesting part when you're trying to figure out who your audience is to also test your negatives, if you will. So if you're working on a movement or an issue or a candidate, we find that it's almost as important to understand the misinformation or the negative opinions about something, that becomes as critical to understanding your audience, where they are, what they're thinking, what words they're choosing. So as you'd suspect, I mean, I would say that knowing your audience is certainly part and parcel to even the communication message you want to put out. So I know we're going to talk today a lot about messaging, but knowing how it's being received and how far they are in the discussion you're trying to have with them is the equal component to having the discussion. And so many of us just come from our point of view, likely when we're at the point of taking motion, whether it's with, again, a candidate. We've been in our world so much, we've been thinking about it so much. I mean, this has happened to everybody up here where by the time the average person is like, I think it's election day, we're 2 years in. I mean, we're so in the bunker. We're so familiar with our issue. So checking back in on where someone is who's civically active, but perhaps not in the space where we are, where we have dedicated so much time to that issue, again, is understanding who you're communicating with is as important as what you're choosing to communicate.
Great, thank you. Natalie, my next question is for you.
Okay.
We've worked on so many issues in Utah and our respective voice in the community on things like the rural economy, Utah's Olympic bid, the inland port, affordable housing, and so many more. So how do you use target audience to shape an initiative like the current Air Quality and Changing Climate Roadmap through the Kempsey Gardner Institute?
Well, that's a difficult question. Let me give some caveats first. I don't think of myself as a professional communicator. Don't run a PR firm. I'm not trained in strategic communications or PR or anything like that. I run a public policy institute, and it's the Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute. And so while I say that I don't think I'm a professional communicator or I'm not trained in all those things, I take a basic philosophy to our work that our audience are busy decision makers who are reluctant readers who are multitasking. So take all those things and lump them together. And so we do highly technical work that then has to be communicated to these multitaskers, busy, reluctant readers. And so at our institute, we try to spend a great deal of time thinking about how we speak about our research. So Andrea's asking me about a really tough one, climate change. Was the essence of your question, is that correct?
It's, I think, a very interesting example
Okay.
of some of the challenging issues you work on.
The legislature asked us last session, in the 2019 session, to prepare a roadmap on air quality in a changing climate. And we are right at the tail end of that work now. We've been working with Utah State University, University of Utah, public entities, industry, other leaders to try to pull together this roadmap. And if you're asking me how do we communicate that, I'll put it this way, and then maybe others can kind of add in, but we're spending about half our time thinking about communication and about half our time thinking about the technical aspects. So that should be very revelatory to all of you, that the ratio is that high, right?
Sure.
And it's because we know if we spent 90% of our time on the technical aspects and then turned it over to Troy, who's a great communicator, and said, okay, go do a press release and go make this work, we would fail. And so we are very carefully thinking about communication. And I'll say one more thing, and then I'll put the mic down. But when I worked at the Environmental Protection Agency, I was over public affairs. So that meant that the media shop and the communications for the agency was under my leadership. And I found that if we couldn't communicate something well, it was bad policy.
Oh.
Right? And it's where I really learned in a really vivid way that communication and policy are deeply integrated. So I don't think for a minute that communication is one thing and policy creation is another. I think of them as entirely intersecting. And it's when you realize you can't communicate something well that you better go back to the policy shop and do some more work. I hope that's a little helpful
Yeah,
insight.
it is very helpful.
Yeah.
And Troy, I'm going to have you leapfrog off that a little because you are such a great communicator.
Am I?
You are sometimes also communicating with elected officials who are busy and have a short attention span for reading, etc. And sometimes you are targeting the general community or specific pieces of the community, and so those are pretty different audiences. Why would you target one over the other, and how do you message differently to target those different audiences?
Yeah, so we're working to advance LGBTQ equality in the state of Utah, and it's a very conservative state, it's a very religious state, and you need to be able to tailor your messaging to the different demographics in the state. And then you also have the LGBT community itself that you also are working with. And it's so essential that we work to move people in the middle, moderates, and also engaging conservatives, because be honest, like progressives and Democrats, they're already kind of with us on most of the issues, but a lot of times there are conservatives who aren't there with us yet. And so we have to take that opportunity to really reach out and engage them in a respectful manner. Not shouting them down if they say something or they go on Twitter or they say something that is offensive to our community. We have to see that as an opportunity for outreach, an opportunity for engagement, to see if there's a way to persuade and move them toward us. And when I'm reaching out to lawmakers or conservatives or people of faith, I often want to try to use their language. Progressives and liberals and conservatives often have in a seemingly more polarized country, we have different language that we use. We have different facts and news sources that we pull from. But we have to be able to tap into the universals that connect all of us together. And we have to be aspirational in that regard. So for us, it is a really delicate dance of finding ways. What if messaging will really move somebody? And I always kind of say that you speak to the heart first. If you can connect with someone heart to heart, then minds will open up and become more pliable, and they'll consider ideas that they hadn't before. And then after minds open, then policies and laws can follow. And we saw that so beautifully with, I think, a master class is really looking at the way that marriage equality, the perceptions of marriage equality shifted across the country probably more rapidly than any other social justice movement ever. And it was because the organizers really were able to identify how we are alike, how we are connected, how love is love, this most basic primal desire to connect and have a union with each other. And that shifted how Americans saw the LGBTQ community. Not focusing on how we were different, but actually focusing on how we are the same.
And from a different perspective, Reed, you've worked on presidential campaigns, gubernatorial candidates, ballot measures, and you're in the national media frequently. So how do you gauge your audience when it is sometimes everyone, or it could be anyone? How do you deal with target audience then?
Well, a candidate campaign and a ballot measure campaign are two very different things, right? A ballot measure campaign doesn't have a spouse that tells you what you think you should do on a daily basis, which is a key difference. That was a joke. Sorry, I went flat. I'll do this better. But I think, I think that there is no such thing as in a campaign, the message will be, I think, one born of research. But I think especially in a candidate campaign, you can really tell the difference between a campaign where the candidate actually has a vision and one in which they don't. I think you could probably, and I will not single anyone out, but there are 17 Democrats left. You could probably see the ones that have something and the ones that don't, because they're able to go out there and convince people across at least the Democratic spectrum, across the donor spectrum, across the media spectrum, that they have something to say. I think, to Troy's point also, and I think to what you were talking about the environmental piece, right? Like, you have to make this something that people can understand. Like, what was Obama for? What was Obama for? Hope and change. Right. What is Donald Trump for? Build the wall, right? Like, that's all you need to know about those two guys and their campaigns, right? How different could they be, literally in every possible way? If you're going to talk about the environment in Utah, you don't talk about how dare you people in Iron County keep digging coal out of the ground because you're killing my grandchildren. You say, do you really want your kids to drive through the inversion? You know how bad the inversion is for all of us, right? It has to touch them in some place they can understand. And so I think also, on the LGBTQ perspective, but I signed the amicus brief, a million years ago. It feels like a million years ago. From a Republican perspective back then, it wasn't about whether or not you could get married or not. It was about what used to be a key pillar of the Republican Party, which was individual liberty. You should be able to live the life you want to live regardless of what the government thinks about you, right? And so I think that was very, very telling. And I think on whether or not it's a presidential campaign or a local campaign or whatever it is, again, it has to start with the message, right? Barack Obama did not invent Facebook. He utilized Facebook as an incredible tool because he had a message, and he was a messenger that was so compelling that people were driven to do something on his behalf, to vote, to organize, to do all those other things. If your message sucks or is hard to understand and you're a terrible messenger, you're not going to go very far. Sorry. Like, that's the end of you probably, eventually, right? If you are muddled on a daily basis, look, I think I met you in the parking lot.
Yes.
Senator Warren.
Thanks for your
Absolutely, I told him
expertise.
where the kiosk was for parking. So look, I think that, Senator Warren, may have a position on, let's say, Medicare for all that might be not totally contrary to mine, but like she believes in it, right? Like you can tell when she gets up on stage, it's something she believes passionately in. And I think you can see her rise in the polls is indicative of that, right? She runs a good campaign, she's a good candidate, and the voters and the donors are taking notice. And so it has to be, I think also to Troy's point, and I'll stop talking, one, all politics is emotional, right? Like you can say, oh, well, you know, the surveys, the top line showed us this, and the crosstabs showed us that this segment and blah, 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 blah. Like those are interesting things. And like you can take, you know, information from those things or like a focus group and learn from those things. But ultimately, like it's got to be something that resonates both with the specific voter you're looking for and provide a broad sort of swath of vision that multiple people, regardless of their inherent background, can get behind.
Okay, so you all have spoken a little bit. Troy, you mentioned a little difference between Democrats and Republicans when you're looking at target audience, and you've also spoken about finding our commonalities, right? There's been a lot of discussion over the years about how you can speak differently to Democrats and Republicans, and an article I remember from a few years ago in the Atlantic was called "Why Democrats and Republicans Literally Speak Different Languages." Can you all, and this is a question to any of you or all of you, can you speak to some of those specific differences? Because I think it's incredibly helpful to see some specifics as a community advocate or as somebody who's really trying to get the attention of someone who may hold a different ideology from them on an issue.
I'll jump in.
Go, Troy.
One of my favorite things to do with my staff, every 2 years, we buy a booth at the Republican State Convention. Okay, and we put up our big queer flags, and we're there, and we're not the strangest people there, by the way. And probably,
not even close.
No, not even close.
Yeah.
But 75 to 80% of the people are kind of excited that we're there, and they come up and they're excited to talk to us. Maybe 20% are a little bit aggro with us, right? And with those folks that are really, they start going after you for something, I always say, stop. I'm like, hey, I know that there is so much that you and I disagree with, so let's just start with finding something that we do agree on. And we start having these conversations. And progressives are so bad, I think, at really claiming our kind of shared American language, right? The idea that about these kind of ethos, like we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, some of the ideals of our founding documents. And progressives are like, yeah, well, those ideals didn't really work well for people of color, and they didn't really work well for women, and all those things are true. But Republicans and conservatives use that language a lot. And so when I started, I used to be more of a sort of left-wing radical kid on KRCL radio, and then all of a sudden I put on the suit and tie to be the lobbyist up on Capitol Hill, where the legislature is like 80% Republican and 90% Latter-day Saints. And all of a sudden, you know, I could say whatever I wanted to on the radio, right? I could be quite ferocious, you know, and I've been arrested at the Capitol, all these things. But then if you want to persuade someone to actually advance a piece of legislation through a super conservative religious body, how are you going to do that? It's incredibly challenging, incredibly difficult. And so your tactics and the way that you talk have to shift dramatically. And so I had to start using languages like the American dream. Like LGBT folks just want to experience just the American dream just like you do. And it was a bit awkward for me because I wasn't used to like talking like that, because it seemed a bit jingoistic, and it seemed like it wasn't congruent with what I knew about American history, and so I had a hard time. But when I did talk about those things with conservatives, the light went off in their head. And they're like, oh, okay, yeah, that liberty and justice for you too. That all means all, right? Yeah, you get it. And all of a sudden, we were trying to have this conversation. When I talk to Latter-day Saints, I always lead with the fact that I grew up Mormon and that I'm a returned missionary. And when I sit down with lawmakers, that's a big deal. And all of a sudden, they have a common ground with me. And they're like, oh, maybe Troy's not too, I mean, he is crazy radical, but maybe there's something that we have in common that we can talk about. Oh, you're a Mormon too. Where'd you go on your mission? And so we talk like that, and all of a sudden, the walls start to crumble a little bit. And that's the key right there. How do you break those barriers down, those things that divide us versus them? And when you start to dissolve those barriers, then you can start moving and having really sort of productive conversations. And I want to brag a little bit that PRRI, which is the Public Religion Research Institute, just did this poll this summer, that Utah, that the residents of Utah, 77% of our state support LGBTQ non-discrimination protection laws. That makes us second in the nation. We're actually tied with Vermont. New Hampshire's number one, and then we tie with Vermont. And our state is more progressive on that issue than New York or California or my home state of Oregon. These big, liberal bastions, right? And I think a lot of it has to do is we just actively are willing to engage conservatives and people of faith. And not apologize for it. I want to move those folks. I want to have a real connection with them. And I think it's starting to pay off. Utah is the only state to ever advance a pro-LGBT non-discrimination law through a Republican-controlled legislature. We're the first state to overturn a gay marriage ban. All right, we're soon, probably this week or next, going to be the 19th state in the nation to overturn or to ban conversion therapy. So things are happening in this state that are unprecedented, that are not happening in Arkansas, Texas, Kentucky, North Carolina, all these other conservative red states, right? But they're happening in Utah. And I think that it's come from both sides willing to engage and talk with each other. So I was super long-winded with that.
It's worth hearing.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that one?
So I want to flip it a little because I think we all know about the divisiveness, and I think that I think there's two categories of speech, and Troy just hit on the biggest one, which is if you want really to make change, you better talk to people who aren't like you, right?
Yes.
I mean, and so then your language becomes thoughtful because you think, okay, you and I can talk and we can get on a roll, and we get on a roll, right? And then we're speaking to each other, and then we move to shorthand, and then we move to really passionate language. But then when I move to someone who's not like me, unless I have figured out the common language, we won't get anywhere. And I mean, if I look at it, I'm going to also pivot where Troy was, which is Utah. So Utah, everyone knows the biggest party in Utah, right? Unaffiliated. So we really have, and I'm sort of going to shift the question from, I would absolutely say that Republicans and Democrats may not have as much common language, but I hope progressives and conservatives do. And by that I say, how brand focused are you on party politics? And how focused are you on the ideas that we're discussing? And so part of it is we're all filtering so much. I mean, I read voraciously, but I have to check myself on my sourcing. And have to say, am I just reading in my genre? Am I looking at news feeds that are supporting my worldview? Or certainly there are credible news feeds that don't support my worldview. I would indict some on the other side that don't support it, but there are absolutely credible news feeds on both sides. And if you can't stomach that, then you are too far in your worldview. And that's not healthy for any of us. I mean, interestingly enough, that's what we're all objecting to. That's what we all don't like. But are we challenging ourselves to also say, where am I getting my information? So one of the things that this is a little off, but we say when someone first comes to us and says, I want to make this change in the world. And I think this is very good for people who are saying, I have a goal, I want to make some change. The first thing we ask is really, what's your goal? Because do you want to speak truth to power? Do you want to shout? Do you want to advocate? Do you want to make sure that you are heard? And that is all super powerful. Or do you want to make change? And do you want to legislate? And do you want to have a vote within the next 12 or 24 months? Because those are two different things. Sometimes the advocacy leads to the vote later, but knowing what your purpose is also probably tells the passion about your story. The other thing I think we're confusing today is speaking passionately without indicting the other side, right? So that's where the differences become. If I can just speak passionately to my why, I'm closer to my heart, I'm closer to his heart. If you can listen to someone speaking to their truth, there's a lot of commonality there. If I have to indict the opposition in order to speak my truth, I've just alienated them. Maybe that's my goal, hey, amen on truth to power sometimes. But if I really am looking for achieving a piece of legislation or achieving a compromise of some kind, really, you can speak from your truth, which has your passion language in it, but you will start to find a common language within that.
Anything else to add?
That doesn't work in political campaigns. There's a reason why negative advertising works a lot, because it is not just so much about making sure your folks show up, but making sure that the other people don't. And that is not something I think is a good thing. I think it is a terrible thing, but I think it is also a calcified system that has produced that, where now we really do have two political parties.
I just changed and said that doesn't work in candidate campaigns. It does work in issue-based campaigns. That's my caveat.
So I would say, yeah, look, I'd love to say that all campaigns, stay like, Lincoln Douglas debates and we're all standing up there and talking about our best issues, but that's just not how the world is. And again, I think if we had the Republican and Democratic parties of old, where you had blue dog Democrats and Rockefeller Republicans, maybe we'd have some more of that, right? I think certainly things have gotten uglier, and I don't see that trajectory, unfortunately, changing. I would like to say one thing about what Troy said about here in Utah, which I found fascinating. Last cycle was my first time although I live here in Utah now for 4 years. Prop 4, the redistricting measure, was my first campaign in the state. And the one thing I found, not so much that redistricting passed by a hair, which is not surprising because on a ballot language, it's a pretty confusing concept, but by how the margins by which both medical marijuana and Medicaid expansion passed, which I think says, if you guys know the legislature far better than I ever will, that should be a wake-up call to them. If the voters writ large were that far afield from where the legislature is, they have a problem, even if they don't know it.
I thought it'd be helpful just to give a couple of examples that weave together some of the thoughts here. Troy mentioned that Utah was the first state in the nation with a Republican-led legislature to pass a non-discrimination statute. So on the day when that happened, I didn't work on that, I didn't have anything to do with it. I'm just running public policy work for the Salt Lake Chamber, but I got a call from Senator Jim DeBackus. Natalie, we've reached a compromise, it's happening. Come on up to the Gold Room, you need to be part of this. I have no idea why he called me, I just don't have anything to do with it. But Jim's an amazing man, I thought, I'll go on up. So I go up to the Gold Room in the Capitol where this is being announced, and it was easily, I have 18 years of experience in Capitol Hill, but it was one of the most memorable moments I've ever experienced in Capitol Hill. It was a beautiful, beautiful moment for our state. But Troy spoke at that event. He doesn't know I was in the room, we're not close, he doesn't know what I'm gonna say. But you'll remember, Troy, what you did. Troy said in his remarks, he said, when I served an LDS mission, and was reading scripture about mourning with those who mourn, which is, I'm LDS, so that's very well-known Mormon scripture from the Book of Mormon. He said, if I had known when I was reading Mourn with Those Who Mourn that this day would happen, it would have, I think he said, changed my life or something. And that's exactly what we're talking about. Troy was able to relate and speak to the heart and at the level that meant something to the people that were part of that compromise. That's the more touching example. The second example I want to give isn't as touching, but when I worked at EPA, air quality is a big deal, obviously. It's the big effort at EPA. Our policy shop had brought to us the most restrictive air quality standards in our nation's history. And in their work that they brought to the communication shop, which I led, they call them the most strident air quality protection rules in our nation's history. So I'm sitting there thinking, okay, I'm in a Republican administration, it's an election year, I got strident. What do I do with that? Anyway, we worked through it and looked at really what we were trying to communicate, and it was really human health, and so we changed it to be the most protective air quality standards in our nation's history. Changed everything. They happened. It worked.
Yes. Own a thesaurus.
Yeah.
I love that specific example, and sometimes it's really those specific examples I think that can be most helpful when someone's writing a letter to their legislator, when somebody is meeting with them in person or coming up to Capitol Hill, which takes a lot of energy and overcoming obstacles for our community members to do that. to be armed with some really specific and basic tips is really helpful. So I challenge you guys to come up with a couple of more of those specific examples of messaging that you've seen that has been successful or that has been unsuccessful, and why, so that they can see a little bit more of those details to inform their communications.
I'll start with one that's going awry right now that we're working on. This is still pretty controversial, so some of you will be already on it. But the Inland Port has started out with some of the worst public messaging that we've seen. And interestingly enough, I think what happened was, from my seat, some well-intended things and some mistimed communication. So by that I say, I'm skipping the lawsuit and I'm skipping the jurisdictional issues with Salt Lake City. I'm just talking about the Inland Port. The Inland Port has been branded. And there's also a thing called the Port Authority. And right now, many of us are seeing no difference between the authority and the port. And the port is a geographic area, the authority is the governing body. And they formed the Port Authority, the legislature formed the Port Authority, and then, I don't know the answer, for whatever reason, it took about a year and a half to hire an executive director. And so in that interim, you have a volunteer lay board that is putting together policies and procedures, and they're making impacts and they're doing things, and the community is getting the sense that this board is moving along and doing these things, but they're not hearing much communication. I think if you were the board, they would say, oh wow, we started having meetings, we're doing the best we can, we don't have a staff, and I'm just giving you both sides. They would say, we're moving forward, but, and then the public is feeling more and more like things are getting solidified, and they're missing what's going on, and they're heavily concerned about what's going on. So there's this lack of information, there's lack of clarity on who can do what when. There's also another jurisdictional issue with Salt Lake City, and it's making everyone really nervous right now. And this is a good example in which what I suspect will happen is that in the long run, if the Port Authority communicates a little better and finds places to draw the community in more, it might turn out to be a place where there are solutions people haven't seen. But right now, you're looking at, if I'm just talking about communications, public communications, and branding, the amount of misinformation and fear and how things got set up and the distrust level is so strong right now with the Port Authority. So it's a little maybe unfair for them because I'm giving you a real-time example that hasn't worked its way probably through the whole process. I'm not giving you something from 3 years ago that we can button up, but it's a really good example of a public discussion that's happening in real time, in which it's lacking some of the basics that people are saying. Who are you? What are the goals? How do I petition you? How do I not? What are you doing? What aren't you doing? That discussion is breeding a lot of misinformation. It's also breeding a ton of distrust. And so that authority has some work to do on public communications.
And communications, the environment is a vacuum. And if you do not fill it, someone else will, right? And every moment you are not out there is another moment that hopefully, let's call it your opposition, is doing and saying whatever they want. And we have now seen, I think all of us have probably, we all grew up, at least I'll speak for myself, without the internet, right? A news cycle was actually like a day, right? Maybe a week. Now it's like 18 seconds. And so the idea that you can ever not be prepared to say something, either proactively to make sure your position is out there, or unfortunately reactively, is a massive, massive problem. I will also say one more thing, and I think somebody might have mentioned it, like, if your policy sucks, there's no good PR for it, right? If you are a company, like in California, like, I don't know if you guys are following out there, like PG&E is like the worst company ever. Not only do they set people on fire or blow up neighborhoods, then they like send their people to wine country while it's all happening, right? Like to some resort. And so like they are poorly managed, they are poorly, they have bad communications, but they think that they have a communications issue. They do not have a communications issue. That they set half the state on fire is their issue, which is an even bigger issue that they can't figure that out, right? So like, to think about that, like, your PR issues are PR issues because something substantive has typically gone wrong.
Yeah. I'll add an example that I think will be helpful. So one of the most difficult things our state's ever been through was the Olympic bid scandal. The reason it was such a big deal, right, is we've been working on it for decades. And literally months before we were to host the games, the bid scandal breaks. And it was threatening to have all the sponsors pool. It was going to take this Olympic dream and burst it all. So that was a really hard issue. I was in the governor's office at the time. We came up with the idea that the public message was, it didn't start here, but it's going to end here. And then put in the necessary reforms to stop this. Anyway, really easy to understand. Proof's in the pudding. We ended up having a terrific Olympic Games. The sponsors didn't pool. They cleaned up the bid scandal mess. But it didn't start here, but it's going to end here.
I'll chat a little bit specifically about our conversion therapy campaign. I literally launched a year ago this week. And before that, people were not talking about conversion therapy, this idea that you can alter, change, reduce a person's sexual orientation or their gender identity. And we have this big giant gala event that we do called Allies every year. It's kind of like the Apple launch. We kind of lay out our policy initiatives for the year. And the feedback that we kept hearing as we were starting to reach out to people, everyone was saying to us, well, that's not happening anymore. That's a relic of the 1970s when they electrocute people, and that doesn't happen anymore. So we cast a pretty wide net. I asked for people to did a survey about their experiences with conversion therapy and got about 100 responses from the ages of 18 to late 60s. And so from that, I kind of brought that number down to about 50 people, and we actually interviewed 50 people. Of those 50 people, we found 10 that were perhaps the most articulate. And it was a really delicate dance because there were people that had really excruciating stories, but they were so angry, they were in so much pain that I couldn't, in good conscience, have them relive that by being spokespeople for the campaign. And so I found, about 10 people that I felt had the fortitude to be messengers for this. And we filmed them, and we edited, and then we started engaging lawmakers, faith leaders, and really started introducing survivors. And now everyone has been talking about conversion therapy the last, especially the last few weeks. But we're really close right now. We're really close. We've actually, and not that this has been easy. It's been a really difficult year on this issue. But we actually, got the governor to a place where I think he'll be I'm hoping this week he'll be issuing the decision on the rule that DOPL has drafted. And it was. I'm really proud of our community for organizing in the way that we did and supporting on the level that we did. And I'm specifically grateful for the people that were courageous enough to tell their stories. It was hard. We had several committee hearings and public hearings where the opposition brought in really transphobic, homophobic testimony. At one point during the legislative session, one of our churro, who was one of our the guys that was telling the story, and the way that they do committee hearings is you have pro con testifying. And as he was testifying, he looked over and he goes, "My conversion therapist is standing in line, waiting to testify next." It was that level of pain and angst, and they all pushed through it. And the 10 that we were working with, they were never angry, and they were never accusatory. They were vulnerable. They expressed their pain, and they did it in a way that reached a lot of people. And in so much, even though legislation collapsed, as often does the first time you run a bill, it moved the governor in so much that he sort of went to DOPL and said, "Let's solve this problem." So I'm hoping, if all goes well, this is wood, that this week we'll have it. But you can create change pretty rapidly too, so.
That's a really great segue into the idea of messengers, and that there are a lot of people who may be in favor or opposed to an issue, and sometimes some of them are better messengers than others. So I'm curious what some of the rest of you think about messengers in terms of selecting who might be that best face or that best voice on different issues, or even some examples of who has been a really good face or voice and who has not.
So for me, messengers are often about the brand that they have built and not necessarily the brand or the idea that you're going for as well. So meaning experts sometimes aren't great messengers, right? They may have the most information, but they're not someone I know. It's not a brand I already trust. So what we know about our own behavior is that third-party validators mean a lot to us. If it's a topic we don't know, but I know Natalie pays attention, if Natalie says it's good, I'm good to go. And I'm probably not even doing much research. And even those of us who are informed use this method all the time, right? I mean, when I'm judging judges, I say to a couple of attorneys, I don't know, do we dislike anybody? Okay, good. How do I dissect all this information coming at me all the time? And a great way to dissect it is who's for it. And if someone's for it, that I resonate with. So what's interesting about us as people is we often disconnect, and so this is an older name, but we used to call it the Lavelle Edwards effect in Utah, because if you could get Lavelle Edwards to sign off for just about anything, you were good to go. And you're like, don't worry, are you for it? Good. Because he had just this, and it was
That's
interesting.
the wrong person to bring up on this
I know
campus.
it is. I know it is.
Coach K.
But I tell you what.
Coach Witt.
I mean, the guy had brand recognition. And we see that now with some of our other community leaders. Gail Miller has become one of those community leaders. And interestingly enough, not speaking to specifically to Gail Miller at all, again, it's not that they're experts in this. It's not that it's their field of expertise. It's a brand that we trust. And as we're trying to sort through everything and sort through how we feel about things, messengers are great. And it's why celebrities often become messengers. It's why, again, public appeal and public name ID becomes so important to this. Now, sometimes there's a role for experts as well, but we have often looked to say you are carrying yourself on the brand of the person delivering your message.
This is very personal for me. If I tell my wife something, she goes, If somebody else tells her that, it's like, oh yeah, of course. Third-party validators are very important, all the way from home to the top. But I think to your point about the celebrity, though, just as a quick thing before we run out of time, is that it has to be the third-party validator has to be someone like a Mrs. Miller who people can embody and personify in their own head, right? Like if some Hollywood celebrity says you should be for this, like, okay, great. Yeah, I'm never gonna meet you, and you have no conception of what it is like to live my life here in Salt Lake, or whatever it is. So like Gail Miller is such a great example, because the Miller family is such an institution here both in Salt Lake and in the state, that people say, well, if Gail Miller's for it, then she wouldn't be for just anything, right? So to your point.
Although I am watching the caucuses, because if you ever noticed so this is Democrat, and
sure.
and so have you ever noticed, I'm trying to figure out what it means, so like Weezer's opening up for Yang, I'm trying to figure out what those things mean to me, and so when I listen to who the band is opening for them in the Iowa caucuses, I'm like, what does that mean?
It's because Yang is for universal basic income.
There you go. And is Weezer, I guess.
And Weezer, I guess.
I want to talk about transgender messaging a little bit. Really, one of the challenges the LGBTQ community has is everyone kind of like knows gay people now. We all have gay cousins and nephews and uncles and aunts, but a lot of people don't know that they know transgender people, and the far fringe right is really exploiting that fear, and doing it in the same kind of cruel manner they did about gay people 30, 40 years ago. And so there's legislation this year that popped up that would have prevented transgender people from changing their birth certificates on their identity documents, and it was proposed by Representative Nelson and Senator Oberland, and folks that had never had any really engagement with the trans community ever. And so what we did, as I brought this, you need this whole idea in activist circles, nothing about us without us, right? You have to have the people affected at the table. And so we brought this 14-year-old transgender boy from Roy Middle School with his Mormon Republican parents, okay, to sit down and meet with the lawmaker face-to-face on the very first day of the session. And that is critical because a lot of the misinformation about trans kids is that parents are just pushing them into hormone therapy and surgery right away, and they don't really sort of know the kind of intricacies and the nuance of it. So bringing in parents that look just like these lawmakers, and then letting this amazing, powerful, articulate young man advocate for himself was so powerful. And you could see the lawmakers, their brains were just like blowing up inside, like they had never, and they're like, whoa. And so we keep doing that. So I have all these Republicans who have Mormons who have trans kids now, and I think God has a really amazing sense of humor on this issue. No, but want someone to learn something, right? And so we bring these families up to meet with conservative lawmakers, and you see all of their fears and misperceptions melt and evaporate like that. And as you'll notice, Utah is one of the only red states where we've never had a transgender bathroom bill even get out of rules to even be considered, because we're having that kind of engagement with lawmakers.
I could ask you all 1,000 more questions, but I want to open it up these last few minutes for some questions from the audience real quick. So, yeah.
I have a question for Troy.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. All right.
Yes.
I have a question for Troy.
Yes.
I'm from here, lived here my whole life also, and the thing that frightens me, and I think a lot of people are frightened about, is the lawsuits on the bakers, especially, who don't want to sell certain things. And people are worried that they're going to lose their religious freedom.
Yeah.
That the church says you must be a member in good standing to work for the church, and they say, no, you have to hire anybody. That's going to destroy religious freedom in the United States. Can you do anything to help allay my fears about that?
Well, I think we have. I think the non-discrimination law is a really good example of how we had to really carefully thread those needles, where the needs of one group seemingly are in conflict with the other. And I would dare to suggest that is more fear than reality. It really is. And when we can, and what's really interesting about that is since marriage equality has been legal for four or 5 years now, I've had complaints of one vendor in Utah who doesn't allow their space to be used for an LGBT wedding. We are not hearing complaints of wedding vendors or cake bakers or dressmakers denying service to the LGBT people, because I think at our very hearts and our core, Utahns are special. I think the way that we're so different on immigration and refugee issues is because Latter-day Saints understand what it's like to be driven from their homes, to be persecuted for being different. And that's a way that we have a common ground and a connection with each other, is that the gay community knows what it's like to be persecuted for being different. Mormons know historically what it's like to be persecuted for being different. We have so much more in common than we have differences.
I would even add, know what it's like presently to be discriminated for being different, and I would just hold up the Book of Mormon play as an example of that.
Yeah.
So I think all of you have spoken a bit to the importance of appealing to where people are at and meeting people where they're at. And so I'm curious about the sort of whether you see there being a risk of appealing to people's bounded rationality and working to use people who are socially constructed in positive ways. Does that ever leave anyone in the margins from a communication standpoint? And what are some ways, if that does happen, that you can address it?
That's a good one. I mean, I just say whatever the issue is, 25% of people hate it. So, like, you could tell them the sky is blue, and they'd be like, no, it's not. Like, it just doesn't matter. But I think that's a great question, and I think one that I think is a healthy though turbulent experience that we're going through in our politics right now, which is there are many millions and millions of people in this country who have been not only felt but been marginalized. From both a sort of macro messaging perspective and also a purely small p political perspective, that I think are now coming to the fore, right? I think if you look at a lot of, this last election cycle, the massive turnout among African American women, right, who finally said, I'm not going to sit here and just be told what I'm going to do anymore, right? I think, and so what I think you're seeing is that there are marginalized, long marginalized communities who are now not waiting to be communicated to, but are standing up and making their voice heard. And I think that although that makes a lot of the status quo politics and sort of society uncomfortable, I think it is an absolutely healthy thing for where we're headed, wherever that might be.
That's such a smart observation. I mean, the other thing I would say is know the different tools. So if a high-profile race like a presidential race, Reed alluded to this before, sort of what are the tools of what you're using. When you're running a candidate campaign, your focus is on winning. It has the ability to elevate some issues, but it's not there to coalesce points of view. It's really there to win. So, okay, so let's say this campaign
Coalescing is like a terrific byproduct.
if it happened, it would be great, right? But along the way, maybe it brings up an issue, or an issue campaign, a high-profile issue campaign brings up an issue. And let's say you're deeper in that thought and that community, and you're seeing really important nuances left out of this very singular discussion that ends in a vote. What that gives you the ability to do is then reach out to the advocacy group that's there every day and say, wow, I'm feeling some wind now on our sails in a way we haven't had for a while. So what can we do as a community organizing group? What can we do as a nonprofit to help now? Because the campaign is a crude tool that's probably maybe not doing justice even to the topic it's discussing in some ways. And it's leaving out and perhaps marginalizing or not speaking with the depth because that's not the tool. But it gives you the opportunity to look to community organizing groups and advance your issue in a deeper, more thoughtful way. So I would just say, remember when your issue or your person or your thinking comes up, look around for the other tools we have in public communications to continue the conversation.
Yeah, and I would say that both having worked with Andrea and now listening to Troy, I mean, if there are folks out there who are fighting for every segment of every, possible piece of the population every day. And I think that it's hugely important that stuff continues to happen, because as I've seen with Action Utah and what I'm hearing from Troy today, is like, this stuff is actually possible, right? None of it's easy, right? And there's a lot of emails and phone calls and banging your head against the desk, but like, it's the knowing that what you're doing makes, a difference to somebody's individual life that I think probably gets you guys up every morning.
And specifically, to your question, so I'll take the trans issue again. Nothing about us without us, right? So if there's an issue that is being debated, a bill that directly impacts the transgender community, the transgender leadership are right by my side, and I am there supporting them. When the media calls me and says, I want a comment from Equality Utah on Trump's military ban of transgender service members, I'm saying, great, let me get you a transgender veteran to talk about these issues. And I don't on the camera, okay? I make sure that the transgender person is face forward in the front line of this. And so, because without us elevating those voices, the fear that divides us and drives some of these measures will never dissipate. We've got to demystify some of the biases and prejudices people have, and that doesn't happen until they get to know us.
Thank you all so much for being here in this really interesting, very helpful discussion. Let's give a round of applause for our panelists. I hope you can join us again for the next Civil Talk number 3 on December 2nd about communicating for impact. Have a good day.
It was a pleasure.